The air in the orbital shipyard tasted of ozone and ambition. Kale adjusted the magnetic clamps on the primary fusion manifold, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet. Around him, the skeletal frame of the Odyssey-class dreadnought stretched into the void, a cathedral of steel and ambition being built by human hands. He was a riveter, a glorified space welder, but he felt like a god forging a new world. Below them, the jewel of the system, a world named Elysium, rotated in perfect silence, a blue and green marble promising a future humanity had only dreamed of. This was the prize. This was why they'd crossed the void. A soft chime sounded in his comms. Kale, status on the aft torpedo bays, came the voice of Alara, his foreman. The Centauri delegation is due for a tour in 2 hours. They want to see the teeth of our new home. He grunted, his voice slightly distorted by the helmet's mic. Nearly done, Alara. Just need to finish this weld. Tell them to bring their sunglasses. It's going to be bright down here. He squeezed the trigger of his plasma torch, a brilliant blue-white jet of superheated gas erupting, sealing another seam in the hull. The Centauri. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. They weren't partners. They were landlords, demanding exorbitant rent for the right to exist in their corner of the galaxy. They called themselves the Collective, a nomadic fleet of bio-ships that had wandered the stars for millennia, never knowing a home, never understanding why anyone would want one. And now, they wanted Elysium. Kale finished his weld and admired the flawless, glowing seam. He was helping to build a fortress to protect their dream. He just hoped it would be enough. Captain Vorlax of the Collective Fleet glided through the observation chamber of his flagship, the Maw of Eternity. The chamber was a sphere of transparent crystalline material, looking out upon the chaotic beauty of the shipyard. Below, the clumsy, angular human vessels took shape, their construction a noisy, inefficient process of brute force and loud machinery. The humans were a paradox to him, so primitive in their physical forms, yet possessed of a startling, almost violent creativity. They built things that were loud, hot, and wasteful, and yet they worked. They were stubborn, infuriatingly so. They refused to see the logic of the Collective's dominion. The galaxy was a shared resource, a commons to be managed for the stability of all. These humans, with their single-minded obsession with one world, were a disruptive variable. They threatened the balance. Their progress is accelerating, a soft, synthesized voice announced from the chamber's walls. It was the ship's consciousness, an extension of Vorlax's own will. The Odyssey is 90% complete. Their defensive platforms are operational. Vorlax extended a tendril of energy, tracing the outline of the human dreadnought. They are insects building a spear to strike a god. It is quaint, but there was no amusement in his thoughts. He had seen their kind before. Civilizations of builders and dreamers who believed their passion was a match for the cold, hard calculus of survival. They were always wrong. Increase the pressure, Vorlax commanded. Seal the orbital lanes. Inform the human overseer that their construction permits are revoked. They will cease all operations immediately. The humans would not like that. He could almost taste their defiance already. It was a familiar, if unpleasant, flavor. Alara's fist slammed onto the comms console, the sound echoing in the suddenly silent command hub of the shipyard. Revoked? They can't just revoke it. That's our home down there. Kale stood beside her, his face a mask of cold fury. The message from Vorlax had been delivered not through diplomatic channels, but as a blunt, unfeeling broadcast that cut through all their frequencies. They're not playing games, Alara, Kale said, his voice low and dangerous. They're scared. Scared of what? Of a species that refused to be cowed. Of a dream that refused to die. Get me a line to every foreman, every deck chief, Alara ordered, her hands flying across the controls. I want every human on this station to hear this. Now. A moment later, her voice, amplified and resonant, boomed through the shipyard's public address system. People of the Elysium Yards, hear me. The Collective has declared our work illegal. They have locked us out of our own future. They think we'll just roll over and die. A murmur of anger rippled through the workers. They don't understand us, Alara continued, her voice rising with passion. We don't beg for a place to live. We build it with our own hands. We are not guests in this galaxy. We are pioneers. And pioneers don't ask for permission. A cheer went up, raw and defiant. Kale grabbed a heavy wrench from a tool bench. They want to shut us down? Let's see what happens when they try to take apart a machine that's still running. He looked at Alara, a shared spark of rebellion in their eyes. This wasn't just about a ship or a planet anymore. This was about who they were. It was time to show the collective what humans were truly made of. The Centauri boarding party moved with silent, predatory grace. Their forms were shifting masses of bioluminescent flesh and crystalline plating, utterly alien to the human-designed environment of the Odyssey-class dreadnought. They flowed through corridors that were too narrow, too straight, their movements a silent ballet of lethal intent. Their mission was simple: sever the primary power conduit and cripple the human vessel before it could become a threat. Vorlax had deemed it a necessary surgical strike, a demonstration of power. The lead Centauri, a scout designated Alpha 7, extended a razor-sharp filament, slicing through a junction panel with ease. The lights in the corridor flickered and died. But then, something unexpected happened. From a nearby maintenance hatch, a figure emerged. It was a human engineer, covered in grime and grease, holding a heavy plasma cutter. The human didn't scream. It didn't beg. It simply stared. Alpha 7's internal processors flagged the creature as a low-threat anomaly. It was alone, unarmed by any standard definition. The Centauri began to advance, a wave of shimmering energy rolling towards the puny organic. The human raised the cutter. It didn't fire. Instead, it spoke. The sound was a guttural, chaotic burst of phonemes, a stream of consonants and vowels that made no logical sense. It was a string of pure, unstructured information. Alpha 7's translation matrix word, trying to find a pattern, a syntax, a meaning. There was none. It was linguistic noise. And then, the human spoke again. This time, the sound was different. It was a single, sharp word, but it was uttered with a force that seemed to warp the air around it. Alpha 7's body convulsed. Its crystalline plating cracked. Its internal systems went into catastrophic failure. It dissolved into a puddle of inert sludge. The other Centauri froze, their advance halted by the sight of their comrades' sudden demise. The human lowered the cutter and spoke again, a long, complex stream of that chaotic, beautiful, weaponized language. The remaining Centauri turned and fled, their minds reeling from an assault they couldn't comprehend. They had faced weapons of energy and matter, but they had never faced a weapon made of words. Kale leaned against the bulkhead, breathing heavily, the plasma cutter still warm in his hands. He had no idea what had just happened. He had been angry, terrified even, when the Centauri had boarded. He had thought of his family, of the dream of Elysium, and a cold fury had taken over. He had just started shouting, the first thing that came to mind, a string of curses, frustrations, and old sea shanties his grandfather had taught him. It was the language of his people, the language of defiance. And it had killed them. He looked at the puddle that had been a Centauri. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics he knew. Alara rounded the corner, her weapon raised, her eyes wide with shock when she saw the scene. Kale, what happened? Are you hurt? He shook his head, his voice a hoarse whisper. I don't know. I just yelled at them. And they broke. Alara stared at the remains, then at Kale. A slow, dawning realization spread across her face. It wasn't just him. It was all of them. Their language, their chaotic, inefficient, beautiful language, was something the collective's perfect, logical minds couldn't process. It was a poison to their translated reality. A weapon. Everyone on this station, Alara said, her voice filled with a newfound awe and dread. Everyone who speaks English needs to start talking. Right now, we need to find out what we can do with this. Kale looked at the dead alien, then at the silent, waiting ship around him. The war had just changed, and for the first time, he felt like they might actually have a chance. Vorlax was seething. The memory of the scout's dissolution played on a loop in his consciousness. It was not just a failure, it was an existential insult. His people communicated through pure, logical data streams. Concepts, equations, intentions. They had evolved beyond the clumsy, inefficient medium of sound and symbol. And these humans, they had weaponized it. Analyze the audio log, Vorlax commanded, his voice a low thrum of anger. Find the pattern, the frequency, the harmonic resonance that caused the failure. His science officers worked frantically, their crystalline fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. "My lord," one reported, her tone laced with disbelief. "There is no pattern. The phonemes are random. The syntax is non-existent. It is noise." Vorlax recoiled. Noise. How could noise unmake one of his finest scouts? It was illogical. It was chaotic. It was terrifying. It was the very antithesis of the collective. "They are using their own weakness as a weapon," Vorlax mused, a cold, hard idea forming in his mind. "They are fighting with chaos itself." He had a counter. The collective did not have weaknesses. They had a singular, unified consciousness. They did not speak. They were. They could share thoughts, intentions, and data without sound. They could communicate across light years in an instant. They could create a weapon the humans could not possibly comprehend. "Prepare the harmonic resonance cannon," Vorlax ordered. "Target the human command hub. We will show them the power of true, silent communication. We will erase their chaotic minds and leave them as empty shells. We will give them the peace of silence." The humans had used sound to kill. The collective would use silence to unmake them. Alara stood in the center of the shipyard's main concourse, a massive open space filled with the noise of 1,000 workers. But now, the noise was different. It was a weapon. "Listen," she shouted, her voice cutting through the din. "Everyone, stop what you're doing and listen to me." Slowly, the clamor died down, replaced by a low hum of anticipation. "The Centauri are coming," she announced. "They're going to hit us with a weapon we can't see, can't hear. But we know how to fight back." She gestured to Kale, who stood beside her, holding a comms unit. Kale here found out something incredible. "Our words, our language, it hurts them. It breaks them. So, we're going to give them the worst headache in the universe." A cheer erupted from the crowd. "I want every single one of you to pick up a comms device. I want you to talk. Talk about your families. Talk about the food you miss. Talk about the first time you saw Elysium. Talk about the stupid things you did as kids. Talk about everything. Fill the void with our voices. Make it so loud, so chaotic, so human that their perfect, silent weapon can't find a single clear frequency to lock onto." The crowd erupted again, this time with a roar of determination. People grabbed comms, started shouting, laughing, singing. The concourse filled with a cacophony of human life. Kale keyed his own mic. He started telling a story about his grandfather, an old, grizzled spacer who had taught him that the universe didn't care about your plans, it cared about your will to keep going. He spoke of the smell of engine grease, the taste of stale coffee, the feeling of a ship's deck vibrating under his feet. He poured his soul into the words, sending them out into the void. They were building a wall of sound, a fortress of human noise to protect their home. The maw of eternity hung in the void, a silent predator preparing to strike. The harmonic resonance cannon charged, a barely visible distortion in space-time building around the ship's bow. Vorlax watched the energy levels climb, his mind focused on the single, elegant task of erasing the human infestation from the system. His fleet was arrayed around the shipyard, a blockade of perfect geometry. They had the humans trapped. They had them outmatched. They had them helpless. "Fire," Vorlax commanded. A wave of pure, silent energy pulsed from the maw, a ripple of non-communication that sped towards the human shipyard. It was a weapon of ultimate control, designed to impose a state of perfect, unthinking emptiness. It should have been instantaneous. It should have been absolute. But as the wave approached the perimeter of the shipyard, it encountered something. It was a wall. Not a physical wall, but a wall of sound. A chaotic, impenetrable barrier of human voices, laughter, stories, and music. The energy wave, designed to function in a vacuum of information, was assaulted by a tsunami of it. It buckled, warped. The human voices weren't just noise. They were a chaotic, ever-changing pattern that the resonance cannon couldn't predict or penetrate. It was like trying to silence a storm by shouting louder than it. The wave washed over the shipyard, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, the lights flickered back on. The shipyard's systems, shielded by the sheer, unstructured volume of human communication, remained intact. Vorlax watched in disbelief as his weapon, the pinnacle of collective technology, had been defeated by noise. It was the most illogical, humiliating defeat in his long existence. The humans had not just defied them. They had used their own primitive nature as an impenetrable shield. The collective fleet was in disarray. The failure of the harmonic resonance cannon was a blow to their very philosophy, a crack in their perfect, logical facade. The human shipyard was not just a physical structure. It was a fortress of defiance, protected by a weapon they couldn't fight. Vorlax stood on the bridge of the maw, his tendrils of energy twitching with agitation. The humans had won the first engagement. They had proven that their chaotic nature could be a strength. He could feel the fear and confusion spreading through his fleet, through the shared consciousness of the collective. For the first time in millennia, they were faced with an enemy that fought by the rules of chaos itself. They have a weapon we cannot defeat. A subordinate's voice echoed in his mind. They have a shield we cannot break. Vorlax looked out at the human shipyard, a beacon of noisy, defiant light in the darkness. He saw the humans moving within it, their forms small but their will immense. They were not just fighting for a planet. They were fighting for the right to be messy, to be flawed, to be human. And in that moment, Vorlax understood. The collective had been wrong. They had seen themselves as the pinnacle of evolution, but they were stagnant. They were perfect, and therefore incomplete. The humans, with their stubborn, illogical, passionate refusal to give up, they were the future. They were the ones who would learn, who would grow, who would become something more. He had come to take their world, but he now realized he was the one who needed to learn from them. The collective needed to change, or they would be left behind in the silent dust of history. The blockade of the collective fleet had vanished. One moment, they were a menacing wall of bioships. The next, they were simply gone. Kale stood on the observation deck of the now-completed Odyssey, looking out at the empty space where their enemy had been. Alara stood beside him, her arm linked with his. "Do you think they're gone for good?" she asked, her voice filled with a cautious hope. Kale looked down at the jewel below them. Elysium. It was more beautiful than any dream he had ever had. The planet was theirs, not because they had fought a war of ships and lasers, but because they had fought a war of words, because they had refused to be silenced. "I don't know," Kale said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "But I think they've finally learned something." He looked at Alara, then at the planet that was now their home. The work wasn't over. They had a world to build, a future to create. But for the first time, it felt possible. They had faced down a galactic empire with nothing more than their voices and their will. They had proven that the most powerful weapon in the universe wasn't made of steel or energy, but of stubborn, unbreakable hope. The Odyssey was no longer just a warship. It was a promise. And as the first human shuttles began their descent towards the blue and green marble below, Kale knew that they were ready to keep it. The revolution was over. The future was just beginning.